Hello, my name is Corey Zalzowski, and I'm the Director of Operations with the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Northwoods, which is located in Anago and Rhineland. We have three sites. I was asked to present today on how to transition, pivot, handle stressful times. And when I was asked, the word pivot was brought up, and I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to use a Friends reference. I'm a big Friends fan, but I think it's really important to talk about how to prepare for crisis and also how to handle and pivot in times of crisis. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And every time I hear the word pivot, I think of this Friends episode. And if you are not a 90s, early 2000s kid like me, you might not recognize this. But Ross and Rachel are trying to move a couch into an apartment and they can't get it up. And Ross just keeps yelling the word pivot, pivot, pivot. And he keeps saying it over and over again, and they get frustrated. And Chandler ends up yelling, "Shut up, shut up, shut up" at him. So, a little bit about me. I am a mom to two kiddos here. I have a daughter who's 8 and a son who's 5. My husband, Brett, and I met in college where I graduated from University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point with a major in public health. I worked in public health for 5 years after graduating. And then I transitioned into working with the Boys and Girls Club. So we moved to Anago, Wisconsin. You can see right here for my husband's business. They have a family-owned business. He's the 4th generation owner of it, which is super cool and exciting. And actually, our club kids go and tour it once a year or twice a year. So it's amazing to be able to bring my family, my club family, and my home family together. I'm a big runner, as you can see here. These are my two closest friends. We run 3 races a year together. This was after one of our half marathons in lacrosse. My husband and I both played hockey growing up, and now both of our kids play hockey. So here they are in their hockey gear. They're both mites and play on the same team. My husband coaches them, and I have also coached hockey in my past. And I have been with the club for, it'll be 6 years in March. And the reason why I transitioned to the club, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, is I was working in public health and it was a 45-minute commute to my work. And I happened to volunteer at a camp. It's a grief camp. It's called Camp Hope. It's hosted at the Lions Camp in Roswell, Wisconsin, which is an amazing camp. And I volunteer there 3 times a year as a counselor. And I typically end up working with the younger kids, 5-year-old girls. As you can see, this is a picture of them and I watching the sunset over the lake. This camp is a camp for kids who have lost loved ones. I have lost quite a few people in my life. Actually, my brother, my mom, and I are the only remaining 3 in our immediate family of 6. We lost my dad, my sister, and my brother. So I wanted to give back in a way that would really help me grieve and then help other people who are going through loss. And so I volunteered at this camp, and it really showed me that I love working with kids. I love being able to make a difference. I love the connection and the growth that not only I get, but also I get to see in the people and the kids that I work with. So I think, 4 months after my first volunteer opportunity at Camp Hope, I ended up looking for jobs with working with youth, and I started out at the Boys and Girls Club. I started out as our community outreach coordinator and moved into our director of operations. And I am in charge of all things policy, safety, facilities, training, pretty much anything that keeps our day-to-day operations going, I am in charge of. So that's me. This is me in a nutshell. I also am an avid reader. I looked at my Kindle the other day and saw that I read 201 books in 2023, which is insane. And my husband did the math on that and told me that's a little over half a book a day, because he's a numbers guy and he really wanted me to know that for some reason. So let's get going. Today, what we're going to talk about is 6 steps to pivot/handle stressful situations. We're going to talk about staying calm, knowing your crisis readiness and response plan or your emergency operations plan, continuing to review and reinforce expectations with your campers, your members, and then reviewing transitions are important, and then how to communicate with campers. So being honest with them without oversharing, and then have backup activities. And I want to just say in advance, grammar and spelling is not my finest point. So if there are typos on this, I apologize in advance, because that I'm just not super good with grammar and with spelling, and Google Slides doesn't always pick everything up on that. So first, crisis is going to happen. It's not going to be an if, it's going to be a when. A crisis, an emergency situation, a stressful situation, it's likely going to happen. So it's best to just prepare yourself for that in advance, just to put that in your mind that there is going to be something that comes up during your camp that is going to cause you to feel stressed or feel off kilter, overwhelmed, whatever that is. So my first thing I always talk about with our staff, as the Boys and Girls Club, we have a 10-week summer program here. I always talk about having a stress management plan prior to camp starting. So having a or calming or coping mechanism ready to go. I actually do a whole half-hour training, half-hour, 45 minutes on self-care and stress management for all of our staff members, because what we always say, we're camper-centered or member-centered or youth-centered, however you want to say, but I like to think of it this way: if we're not staff-centered, if we're not really giving our staff the strategies and the tools to be successful, then we can never be youth-centered. So I do a whole session on stress management, self-care, all of the things, because every summer, this past summer was my 6th summer, every summer right around week 8, we start to see that burnout drop off of our youth development professionals, is what we call them. We start to see them, slide into not being as proactive in some of the things they do. Maybe slipping in a little bit of their supervision, or not doing the activities that are scheduled, things like that. And that's due to overwhelm and burnout. So we try and have them all have a calming and stress management plan prior to camp starting or prior to summer starting. And I highly, highly recommend that you communicate that with your supervisor, with your co-counselor, whomever, so that when a situation does arise, or when you do become overwhelmed, they know what you're going to need in order to step away and be refreshed, or take that 5 minutes, or whatever needs to happen. Have a plan for that. We talk about things like grounding exercises, where you list 5 things you can feel, 4 things you can smell, 3 things, and you go down all the list of your senses. Or deep breathing. There's plenty of things that you can do for stress management. I was actually working on one of my stress management techniques right before this presentation. This past summer, our teens, I worked a lot with them, and they really got into friendship bracelet making, which brought back all the memories from my childhood of when I made friendship bracelets. And if you can see here on the screen, I started doing it with them again, and I've been working on this diamond pattern. So anytime I'm stressed or overwhelmed, I will spend about 5 minutes just working on a friendship bracelet. It just brings me peace and calm, and it really kind of helps regulate me. Just like with our campers or our members or the youth that we're working with, we want to have the tools and the strategies to regulate ourselves, because we cannot, I say this over and over to our staff, we cannot help regulate kids if we are not regulated. So if we are, high, if we're up here, we can't bring kids down here if we're way up there as well. So when a stressful situation or unexpected situation arises, first take a moment to calm and ground yourself. Breathe. Just remember that your attitude and your energy is going to impact the campers or the members. So it's important that you take a moment, breathe, and just step back. It might not be like you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you have to act very quickly, but it might just be a deep breath, and then be confident in the fact that you can handle the situation. And then also on the flip side, if you're unable to handle the situation, call for backup. We don't always have to be right. We just have to get it right. Right. So, we may not be the person who's going to be able to handle the situation. We've all experienced some kind of trauma, some kind of event in our life that is going to trigger us. So recognizing when you're unable to handle the situation is just as important as being able to handle the situation. I tell our staff all the time, know who the person you're going to is going to be, because that that is important when you are in these situations. If you're not able to handle it, who is able to handle it? Who are you going to next? And then I said this before, that remember, campers feed off of your energy. If you're agitated or anxious, they will pick up on that. So that's why that calming and those coping mechanisms are so important, and why you need to have a plan ahead of time. And then using calming stress management strategies for yourself and campers if needed. So number one thing, try and stay calm. I know it's so hard in these situations. I've been involved in many crisis situations. I am oddly, weirdly good in a crisis, which I always wore as a badge of honor. I was like, yeah, I'm really great in a crisis. And then a couple years ago, when I was in counseling, my counselor told me that for some people that's a trauma response and not something to wear as a badge of honor. And I was like, okay, cool. But I'm really good in crisis. I've been in a lot of them. I can handle it. But not everybody can, and that's okay. It's all about knowing your strengths and staying calm in those situations. The second thing I want to talk about is knowing your crisis response plan. So I had an incident when I was volunteering at Camp Hope where a counselor fell down a hill and literally broke her tibia fibula, like her ankle was like hanging off like this. And because it's a volunteer camp, we didn't have a crisis response plan. We didn't have the communication strategies. We didn't carry walkies. It was a very like, okay, we need to figure this out right now and how we're going to handle it. And because I'm good in a crisis, I just jumped in and I helped do all the things. But it reminded me that even in smaller camps or volunteer camps, there should be some kind of crisis response plan. Even if that's just, if a crisis happens, this is who you call. So it's important to know and follow your crisis response plan. You're not going to remember every single word. That would just be impossible. I think our emergency operations plan is what we call it, is like 35, 40 pages long. And I wrote it and I don't even have it fully memorized. So I think the most important thing in your crisis response plan is know who your contact is for communication in a crisis or an emergency, whether that's your direct supervisor, whether that's the head of the camp, whether that's your director of operations, but knowing who that person you're going to go to in a crisis is key. And that's going to really be the game changer for how the situation is handled. I've seen crises handled differently and not done well because of lack of communication or not great communication. I was actually doing a podcast for Marshfield Health Clinic recently, and I was telling them about a time I was on a field trip with 50 kids. I think there was 5 or 6 staff, and we were at a lake about 30 minutes north of our club, and it was first through third graders. Actually, I think it was kindergarten through third graders at that time. And we had unexpected bad weather, and suddenly we were in a tornado warning, and I had to get all of the kids into the bathrooms. And I had just been happening to fill in for a staff member that day who was sick. So it was a good thing that I was there because I could keep everybody calm. And in my role, I had access to be communicating with parents, but also because of my role, I had to be helping our main club manage what was going on at the club for the kids who were not on the field trip. And what had happened is our program director at the time had an old copy of the crisis response plan. I don't know where she had it, how she had it. And it had said that in inclement weather, we go into our basement. And I'm telling her, no, that's not the case. That's not the case. Because she's asking me what to do. This is what it says in the crisis response plan. And I said, no, that's not the case. We go to the gym because we had 75 kids and they weren't going to fit in our basement. Our basement is tiny. So although she didn't have the exact, correct plan with her or had the right steps, she knew who to come to. And I was able to walk her through what the plan was, how to handle it. And then if you're unsure how to handle a crisis or emergency situation, ask for help. I've seen this happen before where people don't want to admit that they don't know the steps or that they don't feel comfortable because then they're seen as not being confident or not being able to handle situations. I can tell you as a leader, as a supervisor, as the person who oversees camp, I would much, much, much rather have you ask for help and knowing your limitations and your strengths and getting the right person in the situation than having you fumble through it and not handle it correctly. Like I said earlier, it is more important that we get it right than we be right. And then remember that the number one priority is campers and staff safety. So we want to make sure that everybody feels safe, is emotionally safe, and mentally safe. And that might happen in stages. So first priority might be physical safety, right? Getting everybody into the gym for that tornado warning. That was like, or into the bathrooms up at the lake. That was physical safety, right? And then as I'm sitting there calming all these third grade girls who are crying, we're trying to calm them down, keep them calm using calming techniques, things like that. We're starting to work on mental and emotional safety. And then there's usually, and I think I talk about this later, but there's usually a piece within our crisis response plan of some kind of follow-up afterwards. When I think about crisis or emergency situations or stressful situations and how I feel afterwards, I always feel like drained and I feel like I need to, emotionally word vomit, just sit there and process. And our kids need that too. The campers, the youth, they need that follow up. They need that time after a crisis to be able to just talk about their emotions, to feel seen, heard, and validated, just like we do. So we had added into our crisis response plan, well, it's called an emergency operations plan, but we added a crisis follow-up for our youth and for our staff members. So if any of our staff members are involved in a major crisis or an emergency situation, and we have a list of what those all are, they are required to speak with their supervisor within 24 hours and do kind of, we call it, can't think of the word right now, but some kind of a follow-up where we check in and we see how they're doing emotionally, how they're feeling mentally, and then we check in and another couple of days and we keep checking just to make sure that there's no lingering trauma, there's no lingering emotional distress. Because like I said, if we're not healthy and we're not ready to go as staff, then we really can't help the members. It's an overused phrase and it's kind of cliche, but we can't pour from an empty cup. It's so true when working with kids. Okay, so here is another huge piece is review and reinforce expectations for your campers and members. I think in a crisis situation, if our members don't know the expectations, if our members don't understand what's expected of them or what good behavior looks like, then all heck can break loose, right? Like, it's chaos. So we have all of our staff create expectations and group agreements at the beginning of the summer. It's the first thing we have them do with their group is sit down when they're in their group for the first time, because we break into grade groups, is we create expectations and group agreements. Expectations are how they will behave and group agreements are how we want to feel. So I just ran a group or ran a program for our teens last night, and they had decided that in their group agreements, they want to feel safe, they want to feel comfortable, they want to feel kind, and calm, and they want to feel respected in that space. And so anytime something comes up, I'm like, okay, do you feel respected? Or is that a respectful thing to say? Do we feel calm when somebody's jittery and moving around, things like that? So it's important to create both those expectations and group agreements. For us at the club, the expectations are pretty similar throughout the entire building, and we have cards for our staff members that they can run through the expectations of each area. So they have expectations for gym, for games room, for our learning center, and then outside, and we make sure those expectations are posted everywhere. So that is a huge thing, making sure that you're posting them, that everybody can see them, that they know them. And then you need to review and reinforce those expectations daily. Every single day, you should be reviewing those expectations. One, if you're a drop-in center like us, you might have had kids not there on the first day, so they missed that creation of expectations and group agreements. So it's important to review them daily. For the first week at camp, our staff usually review them 2 or 3 times per day, just as a reminder for kids. I think about all the things that are going through my head daily and how easy it is to just forget, things. And that's the same thing with our campers. For some of our campers, members, youth, this might be a stressful situation for them going into a camp environment. So they're not thinking clearly the whole first couple days while they're trying to get comfortable. So we need to review and reinforce those expectations daily and doing it in a way that they understand it. So when I review expectations, I always will set the stage by telling them the expectations. And then the next program, I'll say, okay, who can tell me an expectation? And then if someone says, a lot of our kids at the school, they use PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports. And it's be kind, be safe, be respectful, be responsible. Those are the four that they always say. And I'll say, okay, but what does being responsible look like in the gym? Tell me what it would look like to be responsible in the gym. Tell me what it would look like to be respectful in the gym. I think it is so important when you're reviewing expectations, creating expectations, that allowing your campers and your members to put them into their own words so that they really understand them and grasp what being kind, respectful, responsible, and safe mean. And then holding them and yourself accountable to those expectations. I always say that for our staff members, we are the role models. So if we don't want our members, for example, to be on phones, then we should not be on phones, right? That just doesn't set a good tone for the group. So holding yourself accountable and also the campers accountable in a respectful way. We're asking them to be respectful, so we should be respectful to them. And I know there are sometimes in a camp setting, in a club setting, that you do have to raise your voice because it's loud and people need to be hearing you. But I don't think yelling, and I've never seen it really be effective, yelling at a camp member or yelling to get them to stop doing something. What I have seen be really effective is our staff building relationships with our campers, with our members, so that when the time does come to have a hard conversation about not following expectations, there's trust and the member feels safe. And when I see our staff get down on the campers level, like if you're working with first grade and we have our program director, he's 6'4", he's working with first graders, he could easily just stand there and tower over them and maybe instill some fear. Instead, I've seen him over and over again crouch down and get on that member's level to have a conversation. And it really builds a sense of safety and trust in those interactions. And those three things set the stage for, in a crisis or emergency situation, we need to continue to review and reinforce expectations. So, remember, we are going to be kind and safe and respectful. Remember, there is no running in the hallways. Whatever the expectations are, they should still be happening within a crisis situation. Because campers count on staff to provide consistency and structure. This builds trust, which is essential in crisis or emergency situations. When there's something happening that's bad, overwhelming, your campers need to feel safe and they need to trust you in order to be successfully navigating this crisis or emergency situation with campers. I've seen in some situations where the two staff don't really agree on how to handle the situation, and it's made known between the two staff, and our campers can feel that, and then it erodes the trust for those staff that they've built with the campers. So it's important to be consistent and provide that structure for them all throughout camp, not just in a crisis or not just in certain times, because especially our kiddos who have experienced trauma, they thrive on consistency. They need that consistency in order to feel safe, and you need them to feel safe and trust you in an emergency situation. Okay, this leads me right into transitions are key. We do almost 25 minutes of training, 30 minutes of training on transitions for our staff. Transitions are the most important parts of your day, in my opinion. How you transition between programs or activities sets the stage for your next activities or program. So at our facility, our organization, we transition during summer every hour. And so that is a lot of transitions. If you're here for 8 hours, that's 8 transitions, and transitions can really make or break your day. For our kids who have experienced trauma, our kids who are on the spectrum, our kids who have any kind of emotional, behavioral issues, they really, really need the transitions to be good, because transitions are hard for them. They struggle with transitions. And so there's a few tips that I give our staff on how to handle transitions. And especially they're important that when an emergency or crisis occurs, it's essential to transition effectively to provide consistency and stability for campers. Like we talked about, that trust and sense of safety is important in a summer. I mean, it's important when working with youth at any time, but during the summer and during a crisis, it's extremely important. So here are my 3 tips for transitioning. Countdowns. So when you're going to be transitioning, let's say you transition every hour, I always have our staff do a little bit of a countdown. In 15 minutes, we'll be moving to another program. Just a brief announcement. It doesn't have to be super big, thorough, anything like that. In 10 minutes, we'll be moving to the gym for kickball. So at another 5 minutes, give them a 10-minute, and then they give a little bit more detail. And then at 5 minutes, we usually say, please start cleaning up your areas. We'll be moving to another activity in 5 minutes. And then, you could maybe say we'll be going to the gym, whatever. Give them some warning. Then now you've given your countdown, you give them clear instructions for what is expected in the next activity. We'll be moving to the gym next. When you get there, please take a seat so we can review gym expectations and instructions for the next activity. I've seen good transitions and I've seen terrible transitions, and I have seen the difference that sets the stage for the next activity. If you do have a bad transition, you're going to spend 15-20 minutes of your next activity trying to get your kiddos to settle down, to listen to expectations, to listen to instructions. I've seen kids run into the gym, sprint around our gym, grab dodgeballs, start throwing them without getting instruction, and then watching the staff scramble to try and get all the balls put back away, all the kids sitting down quiet. It's a waste of time for your program and for the activity. And also it creates chaos. And that's in that chaos is sometimes when an emergency or crisis situation can happen, because there's no clear direction, there's no clear instructions, expectations haven't been reviewed. Kids, it's a free-for-all in the gym, for example. And I've actually seen that this is when some of our accidents or emergency situations have happened. The other part is reviewing the transition instructions. So for us, we have hallways here, or we're walking from a park, or whatever the transition may be. Prior to the transition, review the transition instructions. So remember, when we're in the hallways, we're going to be at a noise level 1, we're using walking feet, and we're keeping our hands to ourselves. Make sure that you set the stage and the expectations for those transitions for your campers, your youth, your members. And I think that it's important to think of these things even when you're in a crisis. So let's say you have a crisis. I'm going to use our gym as an example. We've had some emergency crisis situations happen in our gym where you have to clear all the members out in order to deal with either a behavior issue or a medical emergency, whatever it may be. And it's important that when you're clearing a space out, you're giving the kids who are leaving clear instructions for that transition. Granted, you're not going to be giving them the countdown, and you're not going to probably be having time to review instructions, but you're going to say, all right, everybody line up on this side, and we're going to go to the games room, which is one of our rooms. And we're going to wait in the games room quietly for instructions on what we're going to do next. So don't drop those transitions, even when an emergency or crisis situation arises. And then the next thing is being honest with campers without oversharing. So honesty is important with campers, especially in stressful situations. You can say things like, we have a medical emergency, we have an unexpected situation, whatever it is, just be honest with them and upfront without oversharing. You don't have to say like, oh, so-and-so pushed so-and-so and now we're calling the ambulance. No, you can just say it's a medical emergency. It's important to share those key details without oversharing. I've seen this happen where staff have maybe overshared in the situation and it causes chaos. We were at a park one time and there was a car circling the block, and our staff, and they had circled the block several times to the point where our staff noticed it and became concerned. And one staff just called me, stepped out to the side, called me, asked what to do. And I said, oh, I'll drive down there. It was only a couple blocks away. So I'll drive down there and just, walk back with you guys. And the other staff member had let it slip to the kids that we were concerned about a car driving by, and all of a sudden chaos just broke out, right? Like it just becomes more than what it needed to be. And it really, after I got down there, it wasn't a crisis or an emergency situation. I'm glad they called me because I'd rather have them be overcautious than not, than forget about something or not worry about it. But all that staff member had to say was, we're gonna go back early from the park. We're gonna walk back. Corey's coming down to walk with us. That's the honesty and what the situation is. We're just gonna walk back. They didn't have to say anything about the car because then that freaks the kids out, and we didn't necessarily know if that was an emergency or crisis situation. And then, if at all possible, phrase the situation a positive way. I think sometimes we have to change our schedules, or we have to change where we're having our programming due to a crisis situation, or just due to miscommunications, or whatever that is. And it's important that we try and remain positive, even though it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating if you plan a program in the gym and you can't run that program in the gym. It can be frustrating if you have to take on a couple extra kids because there is a crisis situation. So finding phrases, simple phrases like, sometimes schedule changes happen, and when they do, we'll make the most of them. Or, we're learning how to adapt to different situations. We're learning how to be flexible, things like that. Try and phrase it in a positive way, because like I said before, your energy influences the campers. And then it's all right to share how you're feeling about a situation. It builds trust. Especially after a crisis situation and the kids are aware of what happened. For example, we had a group a couple summers ago where a kid was sitting on our gaga ball pit, and we don't know what actually happened. We don't know if he had a seizure and then fell off the back of the gaga ball pit, or if he fell off and that caused a seizure. But all of the kids were out there right around him playing gaga ball and had witnessed him have a seizure. And it was hard. It was hard on our kids. It was hard on our staff. It's hard anytime we had to call the ambulance. We had to go through our whole crisis response plan. The kiddo was okay, which was good. We had found out that he had had a seizure earlier that month, so it was something that was happening prior to camp as well. But it really impacted our kids. And so we sat them down. It impacted our staff too. I ended up having a staff member, take the rest of the day off because he was very close with that camper, and we had moved some people around to fill in for him. But one thing we did was we had a follow-up. We had a mental health coordinator at the time. And if you don't have that resource, that's okay. You can do it as the staff member, as the leader, whomever. You don't have to be certified to do some kind of follow-up, but it's important that you do a follow-up, right? Those campers saw what happened. Those campers were struggling to process it. They were scared, they were upset, they were sad. And so we just sat them down and we talked through it. We asked them how they were feeling. We asked them what questions they had. We allowed them to share their feelings. And in that time, we also shared our feelings. Like, we were scared, during the situation, we did what we needed to do, but we were still scared for our camper, and we were still, worried about him. And then remembering that it's okay to share your feelings, and that acknowledge those feelings of the camper, making them feel heard and seen and validated. There's nothing worse than when you open yourself up and you're vulnerable and you share your feelings, and someone says, oh no, that's not right. In every situation, we all have different perspectives. We all have different outlooks. We all look at situations differently. So we all have different feelings about the situation. And it's important that we acknowledge those feelings with our campers and within ourselves. And then remembering that you set the tone for campers. So lead by example. Lead by example by being vulnerable. Lead by example by being kind, by listening, not telling campers how they should feel. Listening with curiosity kind of is what I try and tell our staff. So if a camper says something that maybe you're kind of like, oh, that sounds a little, off, or that sounds concerning, or the phrase that I have our staff really use is, tell me more about that. So if a camper tells you, I'm feeling really triggered, or I'm feeling, they probably wouldn't use the word trigger, but if they share an emotion or a feeling that kind of raises that, that instinct in you to think, okay, this feels like it's it is a trigger. It's kind of about the situation, but it feels deeper. Tell me more about that. Would you be willing to share things like that? And then last thing is have backup activities planned. So it's not an if, it's a when something happens, whether that be a crisis, an emergency, having to pivot because the program or the activity changes or the space changes or it rains. Camp is just it's amazing, but it can be unpredictable, right? There are so many variables like weather, campers, staff members, space, there's just all these variables that go into camp. So we need to be prepared. It's not an if, it's a when something happens. And so we need to have backup activities that can be done anywhere, planned and ready to go. So we ask our staff, they do all of their program planning at the beginning of summer. We're shut down for 2 weeks, and that's when they do their program planning. We also tell them to plan like 5 to 10 quick activities that they could do in any space. Whether that be a team building exercise or, I don't know, making friendship bracelets, whatever it is. So something, having a deck of cards, something that you can do in any space, having planned, and then carry a backpack. All our staff carry a backpack with all of their supplies in it. So always having some kind of supplies ready for those backup activities. It's important that even when the program or activity changes, to review expectations and provide clear instructions on what will be happening. So just because it's a different activity that you planned or in a different space than you planned, or you have a different group or something's different, the expectations and the structure of your program should still be the same. You should still review expectations. You should still provide clear instructions. And then it's also okay to recognize that if your campers need the space to relax and recover after a crisis or emergency situation, provide that space, right? Sometimes, we'll remove campers from a medical emergency situation or behavior situation, and we're all just emotionally exhausted and we just need the space to chill and relax. And it's okay to provide that space for your campers. If you're like us, if you're not going to do the activity that's planned or on your schedule, we just ask that our leaders of our groups communicate that with our program directors. So we use walkies for our communication system, and we just ask that they communicate that. There's hardly, especially when a crisis situation is happening, there's rarely ever a time our program director would say, no, you can't relax, you need to go play in the gym. If we trust that our staff know the campers best, and so when they communicate that there's a break that needs to be happened, we trust that they're doing that out of the best interest of their campers. Obviously, if they're doing that every day or multiple times a day, then it's different. But especially following crisis situations, sometimes campers, staff, youth, kids, everybody just needs to relax and recover. And then this is what I talked about. I think this is just as important as being prepared for a crisis. So after the situation is over, you have taken the time and space you need to reflect on the situation. So after we've calmed down, after our adrenaline has come down a little, and we've had the time and the space to cope and handle the situation, it's important to reflect. It's important to look back on what happened and ask yourself, what did we or you do well? What could you or we improve upon? What changes need to be made? What follow-up needs to happen? And this can be done by yourself, and with your co-leader, or you could involve your leadership. So if you and your co-leader are doing it, and this is not something your leadership does regularly, I do this with staff after every crisis situation. This is part of the follow-up that I talked about. I follow up with them emotionally to make sure that they're okay, but I also follow up like operational wise. What did we do well? What can we improve upon? What changes need to be made, and what follow-up needs to happen? If your leadership doesn't do that with you, you can do this on your own and then just communicate with them. Crisis and emergency response is an active process, and it requires input and feedback from every level of the organization to be successful. I make these plans. I sit in my office and I make them. And although I have experience working in programs, and I have experience working in the leading of groups and through my volunteering and also stepping into programs here. The way that I look at a crisis situation is different than other people look at a crisis situation. And I might not always have the best perspective. And I rely on my staff to come to me and say, hey, you said we should do this, this, and this. However, in this situation, this is what happened. We followed those steps and it didn't really work well. And then I'll say, okay, tell me more about that. What can we do to improve? What changes need to be made? What follow-up needs to happen? Um, we had a crisis situation and it was a behavior one. It wasn't like a huge crisis, but one of the things we realized was that we could have prevented this crisis, right? So one of our members was really upset because we asked them to put something away in their backpack. And it was during one of our program times where we should have had all distractions away in general. And we have a space for backpacks, right? So really the backpack shouldn't have went into the program space to begin with. So it was preventative. And so when we reviewed the situation, we talked about what happened, what did we do well, what could we improve upon, and what changes need to be made. And one of the changes that needed to be made was that we need to be consistent in following those expectations. If we say no backpacks or no phones or whatever it may be is not allowed in programming, then we have to stick to that, right? We have to follow that. And we talked about a few other things related to the matter, and we actually ended up making some changes to our expectations. And also we made some changes to how we handle a crisis. For example, this was at our teen center site. I happened to be there, which was lucky because we have two staff over there and me. And so I was able to stay with the teen who was very upset, very, agitated and starting to get aggressive. And then one of our staff members was with the larger group. And then our third staff member went and grabbed the emergency contact list and called the parent. But we recognized that if there were only two of them there, then they wouldn't have been able to, leave. So that brought us to the point where our emergency contact list has to be like on our staff at all times. So those changes happen. Those changes need to be made. And it's important to remember that no plan is perfect and there will always be adaptations. And that's okay. That's needed. That's 100% what crisis emergency response is it's a learning process, and we're always changing and adapting to meet the needs of our youth. And that is all I have. So I hope that you all found a little piece that you can take forward into your camp, into your summer, into wherever you're going to be. And I hope that you take one little tidbit. I recently heard a fact that people only retain 25% of what they hear in a presentation. So I hope that in that somewhere in my presentation, you found something that'll help you in your summer camp. And good luck.